So the first explicit version of the argument from mercy that Rachel presents in this chapter is an argument that's framed within the context of utilitarianism. And so the first premise that he presents to us here is any action or social policy is morally right if it serves to increase the amount of happiness in the world or to decrease the amount of misery. Conversely, an action or social policy is morally wrong if it serves to decrease happiness or to increase misery. The second premise says the policy of killing, at their own request, hopelessly ill patients who are suffering great pain would decrease the amount of misery in the world. And then it concludes, therefore, such a policy would be morally right. Now, there are two things that we'll want to note about this argument. First, that the conclusion itself is stronger than the initial statement Rachels makes when he talks about the main idea of the argument for mercy. There, he talks about it being morally permissible or not morally wrong. This argument says that it's morally right, that this is a morally good thing. So it's a stronger conclusion than the conclusion that Rachel suggests initially. The second thing that we'll want to note is that first premise in the argument here, it articulates that utilitarian principle, what Mill calls the greatest happiness principle. And it's this assumption of the greatest happiness principle in the argument that Rachel's is going to base his objections to the argument around. And so when we go through and we look at this chapter and we ask ourselves, well, why has he even introduced this argument? I think that by introducing this argument, he talks about one morally relevant feature that the argument captures, reinforces this idea that he articulated in the chapters on utilitarianism, that it is morally relevant, the amount of happiness that an action generates, or conversely, the amount of misery. That's something that's morally relevant to its ethical standing. However, he's going to suggest, as he did in the chapter on utilitarianism, that that isn't the exclusive feature of any particular action that determines its ethical standing. And so in his criticism, he notes that the argument relies on this greatest happiness principle. And he points out that the greatest happiness principle claims that an action's net production of happiness provides the exclusive and exhaustive measure of its ethical standing. So he says that idea, that is the central insight or the central claim in utilitarianism, is the source of unacceptable consequences. The view has implications that seem unintuitive to us. They contradict our ethical intuitions, they contradict our common sense ethical standards and judgments. And so he spells out that kind of criticism, which he gave in the utilitarian chapters, again, to illustrate this point. And so he says, and we can come up with arguments that use this greatest happiness principle that seem to condone, morally recommend, even maybe morally oblige us to engage in particular actions that intuitively and reflectively just do not seem to be ethically acceptable, certainly not ethically praiseworthy. And so he gives us two examples of how this might work. The first example talks about religious freedom. And here the idea is that having people who disagree about their religious convictions generates tension and disharmony in society, and having people trying to decide for themselves what religious doctrine be leads possibly to greater incidence of crises of faith. And hence, if we discovered that, in fact, empirically, it would increase the overall unity, cohesion, and hence happiness of society if we abolished religious freedom, that is, if we enforced a particular religious creed and didn't allow people to question religious doctrine, that everyone had to have the same doctrine across all our society, if we discovered that that in fact would create a more harmonious and hence happier society, then this principle would seem to argue that it is morally obligatory and morally praiseworthy that we abolish religious freedom. And he says this clashes with our intuitions and our common sense moral judgments about whether or not religious freedom is something that should be abolished or if it is something that should be encouraged. The second example that he gives is an example that is closer in terms of its content to the euthanasia argument. And this argument is an argument about whether or not we should morally be obliged to, say, kill chronically unhappy or routinely depressed or dysphoric individuals. And the argument would go something like this, right? Look, a policy of killing chronically unhappy or dysphoric or depressed individuals, that would reduce the amount of unhappiness, dysphoria, and hence increase the total net happiness had by the members of society taken then as a whole. And hence the principle that is assumed in that first premise of the utilitarian argument again seems to say that we are morally praiseworthy, that's the morally correct thing to do, that we're morally obliged to kill chronically unhappy people because it results in an increased net happiness. Now, both of these arguments are versions of the objection that Rachel brings up in the utilitarian chapter, where he says it looks like there are other features, other factors of an action that have relevance to its moral worth, and that just the production, the net production of happiness, that can't be the only measure of the ethical standing of an action. And so the examples that he focused on in the utilitarian chapter were examples of people who act in ways that seem patently unjust, but that do produce a greater happiness in society overall, like giving false testimony to prevent a race riot, or actions that seem to ignore or steamroll over individual rights in order to create greater happiness for the greatest number, like the unwilling organ donor examples. And so in the utilitarian chapter, and again here, right, what he suggests is that these arguments show that efforts to increase pleasure and decrease pain have to also be tempered by or have as additional goals or points of evaluation their ability to do things like promote freedom, to be consistent with justice, and to respect individual rights. And so by going through this utilitarian argument and showing why he thinks the utilitarian argument captures this idea that pain is intrinsically bad, and hence allowing people to continue in a pointless existence of excruciating agony it's morally acceptable to end their lives to prevent them from having that additional intrinsic harm done to them by the disease. He says we also have to take these other considerations into account. So individual choices, individual rights, and an overall sense of the justness, the fairness of the actions that we take. And so he wants to reformulate the argument. He gives us this final version of the argument that takes these other features into account and provides a more balanced set of criterion for when it's morally permissible to kill somebody who's in excruciating pain as part of their terminal illness.